For 15 years, he fixed their leaks, collected their trash, and kept their building running. Tenants walked past him like he was invisible, just the old black janitor who lived in the basement, until the day someone Googled his name and found the Medal of Honor citation. Robert Washington had single-handedly saved 47 soldiers in Vietnam, and nobody knew. Welcome to Honor Untold. Before we tell this incredible story of America's highest honor hidden in plain sight, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe our greatest heroes often serve in silence, hit that subscribe button and help us honor their stories. Sunset Apartments in Elmhurst, Queens, wasn't the fanciest building in New York, but it was home to 48 families who counted on one man to keep their world functioning. Robert Washington, 76 years old, had been the building superintendent for 15 years. Every morning at 6 a.m., he'd emerge from his basement apartment with his toolbox and begin another day of invisible service. To most tenants, Bob was just part of the building's infrastructure, like the elevator or the heating system, something that worked quietly in the background until it didn't, and then you called for repairs. He was polite, efficient, and forgettable, the kind of man people looked through rather than at. Mrs. Chen, who managed the property for an overseas investment company, appreciated Bob's reliability. He never calls in sick, never asks for raises, fixes everything himself. She'd tell people, perfect super, quiet, keeps to himself, no drama. The tenants had their own opinions. To them, Bob was the slow old man who took too long to fix things, who mumbled when he spoke, who lived alone in the basement like some kind of building hermit. Young professionals rushing to catch trains barely acknowledged him. Families with children saw him as the maintenance guy who kept their kids' toys out of the hallways. Nobody asked about his past. Nobody wondered why a 76-year-old man was still working such a physically demanding job. Nobody noticed the way he stood perfectly straight despite his age, or how his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings with military precision. Bob's routine never changed. Up at 5:30 a.m., black coffee in a Vietnam veteran's mug that no one ever paid attention to, then out to check the building systems: boiler, water pressure, security cameras, trash collection. By the time tenants started their day, Bob had already been working for 2 hours. His basement apartment was sparse but organized with military precision: a single bed, a small kitchen, a TV, and one wall that he kept carefully covered with a curtain. Behind that curtain were memories he rarely looked at anymore: photographs, citations, and a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. The building's residents treated Bob with the casual indifference reserved for service workers. Mrs. Patterson in 4B was the worst, constantly complaining about response times, questioning his competence, suggesting to Mrs. Chen that maybe it was time for someone younger and more energetic. "I don't know why we keep that old man around," she'd say during building meetings. "Half the time, I don't think he even understands what I'm asking for." Bob would just nod and continue working. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, that dignity came from service itself rather than recognition for service. But sometimes, late at night, the dismissal stung more than he cared to admit. Marcus Johnson was different. The 30-year-old Iraq War veteran had moved into 7C 3 months ago and was one of the few tenants who actually looked Bob in the eye when they spoke. There was recognition there, one veteran sensing another, even without words being spoken. It started with a broken garbage disposal in apartment 3A. Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old marketing executive, was hosting a dinner party when the kitchen sink backed up. She called the super, frustrated and embarrassed, as her guests waited while she dealt with building issues. Bob arrived within 10 minutes, tools in hand, ready to fix the problem. But Jennifer was stressed, her carefully planned evening falling apart, and she took it out on the first available target. "This building is falling apart," she snapped. "The management company needs to hire someone who actually knows what they're doing, instead of some old man who can barely climb the stairs." Bob said nothing. He fixed the disposal in 15 minutes, tested it twice, cleaned up his tools, and left without a word. Jennifer returned to her party, crisis averted, the maintenance man already forgotten. But one of her guests, David Kim, had watched the interaction with growing discomfort. A journalist by trade, he was bothered by the casual disrespect he'd witnessed. After dinner, as Jennifer continued complaining about the building's inadequate maintenance staff, David found himself curious about the quiet man who'd solved their problem so efficiently. "What's the super's name?" he asked. "Bob something," Jennifer replied dismissively. "Washington, I think. Just some old guy who lives in the basement." That night, David couldn't sleep. Something about the superintendent nagged at him. The man's bearing, his competence, the way he'd absorbed Jennifer's rudeness without reaction. On impulse, David opened his laptop and typed Robert Washington into Google. The first result changed everything. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as a squad leader with Company B, 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, in the Republic of Vietnam on 15th August 1969. David read the Medal of Honor citation 3 times before he could process what he was seeing. The quiet janitor who'd fixed Jennifer's sink had single-handedly saved 47 soldiers during an enemy assault in Vietnam. The old man they'd treated like invisible help was one of America's most decorated heroes. The citation continued. Sergeant Washington repeatedly exposed himself to intense enemy fire to rescue wounded comrades from an overrun position. When his unit was pinned down by superior enemy forces, Sergeant Washington charged the enemy position alone, enabling the evacuation of the wounded. His extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. David scrolled through more results. Photos of a young Robert Washington receiving the medal from President Nixon. Newspaper articles from 1969 describing his heroism. A brief mention in a book about Medal of Honor recipients. And then, nothing. No recent interviews. No speaking engagements. No public appearances. The trail went cold in the 1970s. Robert Washington had received America's highest military honor and then disappeared into ordinary life, spending the last 15 years as a building superintendent in Queens, invisible to the very people he'd once risked everything to protect. David couldn't let it go. The next morning, he waited in the lobby until he saw Bob making his rounds. When the superintendent emerged from checking the mailroom, David approached him carefully. "Mr. Washington, could I speak with you for a moment?" Bob looked up, surprised. In 15 years, No tenant had ever asked to speak with him about anything other than repairs. I'm David Kim from 3A. I was at Jennifer's apartment last night when you fixed the disposal. David paused, unsure how to continue. I I looked you up online. I know who you are. Bob's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. I'm the building super, son. That's who I am. You're also a Medal of Honor recipient, David said quietly. You saved 47 soldiers in Vietnam. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Bob sighed and set down his toolbox. That was a long time ago. Different person, different life. Mister Washington, do you realize that no one here knows? These people who complain about slow repairs, who treat you like. David struggled for words. You're a national hero. Bob's laugh was bitter. Hero doesn't pay rent, son. Hero doesn't fix boilers or unclog drains. I'm just trying to earn my keep like everyone else. But David could see through the deflection. Why here? Why this job? You could be giving speeches, writing books, working with veterans organizations. Because this is real, Bob replied. This is service without cameras, without applause, without people telling me how grateful they are. These folks need their building maintained. And I can do that. It's honest work. Despite Bob's reluctance to discuss his past, David couldn't keep the discovery to himself. He started with Marcus, the Iraq veteran from 7C, figuring another soldier would understand the significance. Marcus's reaction was immediate and emotional. Are you kidding me? Bob Washington? The Bob Washington. I read about him in military history class. That man is a legend. Word spread through the building like wildfire, but not in the way David had expected. Instead of respect and admiration, the revelation seemed to make some tenants uncomfortable. Mrs. Patterson was particularly defensive. Well, that doesn't excuse poor maintenance, she sniffed. War hero or not, he still takes forever to fix my radiator. Others seemed almost resentful, as if Bob had been hiding his identity to make them look bad. A few young professionals acted like they'd known all along, suddenly claiming to have always respected Bob's military bearing. But some reactions were different. Mrs. Rodriguez from 5B, whose son was currently deployed in Afghanistan, sought Bob out with tears in her eyes. I had no idea, she said. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for what you're still doing. Bob was mortified by the attention. He'd spent 15 years in comfortable anonymity, and suddenly tenants were staring at him, whispering in the hallways, treating him with an awkward mixture of newfound respect and embarrassment. Marcus became Bob's most persistent visitor. The young Iraq veteran would find excuses to help with building maintenance, creating opportunities for conversation that Bob initially resisted, but gradually came to appreciate. Why don't you wear your medal? Marcus asked one day, as they worked on the building's HVAC system. It's not jewelry, Bob replied. It's not something you wear to impress people. But people should know. Kids should know. There are so few Medal of Honor recipients left alive. Bob paused his work. You think wearing a medal would change how Mrs. Patterson talks to me? You think it would make Jennifer Walsh respect me more? Honor doesn't come from what's pinned to your chest, son. It comes from what you do when nobody's watching. Marcus understood, but he also saw something else. The loneliness of carrying such a burden alone. Do you ever talk to other recipients? There's a whole organization. I know about the organization, Bob said quietly. I went to one meeting, back in the 80s. Room full of men trying to figure out how to live with being called heroes for the worst day of their lives. Decided I'd rather just live. But Marcus persisted gently. He began sharing his own struggles with coming home from Iraq, the difficulty of transitioning to civilian life, the challenge of finding purpose after military service. Slowly, Bob began to open up. One evening, Marcus was helping Bob replace a water heater when he noticed the covered wall in Bob's basement apartment. The curtain had shifted, revealing the edge of a framed photograph. "Is that your medal?" Marcus asked. Bob glanced at the wall and sighed. "Among other things." "Can I see it?" For a moment, Bob hesitated. Then he walked over and pulled back the curtain, revealing a carefully curated memorial wall, the Medal of Honor in its presentation case, photos of his unit in Vietnam, newspaper clippings from 1969, letters from the families of soldiers he'd saved, and in the center, a photo of 47 young men, the soldiers whose lives he'd preserved that day in August 1969. Marcus stared in silence. Finally, he whispered, "Jesus, Bob, look at them. Look how young they were. 18, 19, 20 years old," Bob said. "Most of them younger than you are now. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Because of you. Despite me," Bob corrected. "I was their squad leader. I was supposed to keep them safe. When that position got overrun, when they were pinned down, I should have seen it coming. Should have positioned us better." Marcus turned to face him. "You saved 47 lives, Bob. The citation says you charged an enemy position alone. You took on superior forces to evacuate the wounded." "I did what any squad leader would do," Bob replied. "What any decent person would do. The medal, the ceremony, all that came later. Politicians needed a hero story. I just needed my boys to get home." David's journalist instincts eventually won out. Despite Bob's wishes for privacy, he wrote a story about the Medal of Honor recipient working as a building superintendent in Queens. The story went viral within hours. "America's Most Humble Hero, Medal of Honor. Winner serves quietly as apartment building super." Ran on news websites across the country. TV crews started showing up at Sunset Apartments. Veterans organizations reached out. Politicians wanted photo opportunities. Bob was devastated. The anonymity he'd cultivated for 15 years evaporated overnight. Tenants who'd ignored him for years were suddenly claiming friendship. Strangers knocked on his door, asking for autographs. The simple, quiet life he'd built was falling apart. Mrs. Chen was thrilled by the publicity. "This is wonderful for the building's reputation," she told Bob. "We could charge higher rents now. Home of Medal of Honor hero. This is great marketing." But Bob just felt exposed and violated. That evening, he sat in his basement apartment staring at the wall of memories, considering whether it was time to disappear again. He'd done it before, left towns when the attention became too much, when people wanted him to be something he wasn't. Marcus found him there, looking defeated. "You're thinking of leaving, aren't you?" Bob nodded. "Can't go back to being invisible now. Everyone knows. Everyone's watching." "Good," Marcus said firmly. "Maybe it's time people did watch. Maybe it's time they learned what real service looks like." The media attention eventually died down, but something fundamental had changed in the building. Not just in how people treated Bob, though most tenants now greeted him respectfully, and some even stopped to chat, but in Bob's own sense of purpose. young veterans started seeking him out. Marcus had connected him with a veterans support group, and word spread that there was a Medal of Honor recipient in Queens who understood the challenges of transitioning to civilian life. Bob found himself reluctantly becoming a counselor and mentor. "I don't know what to tell you, kids," he'd say during informal sessions in the building's community room. "I never figured it out myself. 40 years later, I'm still trying to understand how to live with it." But that honesty, that acknowledgement that even heroes struggled, was exactly what younger veterans needed to hear. Bob's lack of answers became more valuable than any prescribed wisdom could have been. Mrs. Patterson, embarrassed by her years of complaints about the building's inadequate maintenance, had become one of Bob's most vocal supporters. She started a building fund to upgrade Bob's basement apartment and pushed the management company to give him a substantial raise. "I feel terrible about how I treated him," she confided to David. "All those years, I thought he was just some slow old man. I never bothered to see him as a person, let alone as someone who'd sacrificed so much for his country." Bob's story had an unexpected impact on the building's children. Parents who'd previously told their kids to stay out of the super's way now brought them down to meet Mr. Washington and learn about service and sacrifice. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez became Bob's unofficial assistant, helping him sort mail and carrying his lighter tools. Her mother had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and Emma understood that Mr. Bob was someone special. "Were you scared in the war?" she asked him one day as they replaced light bulbs in the hallway. "Every day," Bob answered honestly. "Being scared doesn't make you weak, Emma. It makes you human. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared." These conversations, casual and unguarded, became Bob's most important work, not the formal speeches he occasionally agreed to give, but the quiet moments teaching children about service, sacrifice, and the difference between being famous and being worthy of respect. A local elementary school invited Bob to speak on Veterans Day. He initially declined, but Emma convinced him, "Please, mister. Bob, I want my class to meet a real hero." His speech was simple. Heroes aren't people who don't get scared. Heroes aren't people who never make mistakes. Heroes are people who show up when others need help, even when it's hard, even when nobody notices, even when there's no reward except knowing you did what was right. 2 years after David's Google search changed everything, Bob was still the superintendent of Sunset Apartments, but now he worked with dignity, respect, and recognition from the community he served. The building had become a gathering place for veterans in the area. Bob's basement apartment hosted informal support groups, and the community room regularly held events honoring local military families. What had started as one man's quiet service had become a neighborhood resource. Marcus, inspired by Bob's example, had left his corporate job to work with veterans organizations full time. "Bob taught me that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform," he explained. "It just changes form." Jennifer Walsh, the marketing executive, whose broken disposal had started the whole chain of events, had become one of Bob's biggest advocates. She organized fundraisers for veterans charities and frequently brought her business colleagues to meet the most remarkable man in New York. "I was horrible to him," she'd tell people. Here was this incredible person, and I treated him like he was nothing. It taught me that you never know who you're talking to. Everyone has a story worth respecting. Bob still kept his Medal of Honor behind the curtain, but he'd opened that curtain more often. When young veterans visited, when children asked about service, when people needed to understand what real heroism looked like. On quiet Sunday mornings, Bob would sit in the building's small garden he'd cultivated over the years, reading letters from the families of the 47 soldiers he'd saved in Vietnam. Some wrote regularly, updating him on grandchildren and careers and lives made possible by his actions on one August day in 1969. You probably don't remember me, one letter began, but you saved my father's life in Vietnam. He came home, married my mother, raised 4 children, and lived to see his grandchildren. I just wanted you to know that because of your courage that day, there are now 23 people in our family who exist because you brought him home. These letters came regularly, dozens of them over the years. Families thanking him for fathers and grandfathers and great grandfathers who'd lived full lives because Sergeant Robert Washington had risked everything to save them. Bob kept every letter, understanding finally that his service hadn't ended in Vietnam or even with his Medal of Honor. It continued every day in the building he maintained, in the veterans he counseled, in the children he taught about courage and sacrifice. I used to think the medal was for one day, he told Marcus during one of their regular conversations. One day when I did something extraordinary, but I understand now it was for a lifetime. Every day after that day, I had to prove I was worthy of what those 47 boys went on to accomplish with the lives I helped save. Robert Washington never sought recognition for his service, not in Vietnam and not in the 15 years he spent as a building superintendent in Queens. But recognition found him anyway, not because he wanted it, but because his story needed to be told. His journey teaches us that heroism doesn't end with a single act of courage. The Medal of Honor he earned in Vietnam was just the beginning of a lifetime of quiet service, maintaining a building, mentoring young veterans, showing children what real strength looks like. For 15 years, tenants walked past him like he was invisible, never knowing they were in the presence of someone who embodied the highest ideals of service and sacrifice. His honor was never untold. It was being lived out daily in small acts of maintenance and care that kept their world functioning. Bob's story reminds us that our greatest heroes often serve in silence, asking for nothing more than the dignity of honest work and the satisfaction of making other people's lives a little better. They don't wear their medals or display their achievements. They simply show up day after day and serve. The next time you encounter someone in a service role, a janitor, a maintenance worker, a security guard, remember Robert Washington. Remember that behind every uniform, every name tag, every quiet person doing essential work, there might be a story of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Honor isn't always announced. Sometimes it sweeps floors, fixes leaks, and lives in basement apartments. Sometimes it's invisible until someone takes the time to look, to ask, to care about the person behind the service. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet service hid an extraordinary past? Someone who served with distinction but never sought recognition? Someone who embodied honor in the most humble circumstances? Share their story in the comments and tell us what city you're watching from. At Honor Untold, we believe that America's greatest heroes often hide in plain sight, serving our communities with the same dedication they once served our country. Subscribe to join our mission of revealing the honor that lives among us every day, because sometimes the most decorated heroes are the one who never speak of their decorations. And sometimes the greatest service happens when no one is watching. Until next time, remember, the person you pass in the hallway, the one who keeps your world running, might be carrying more honor than you could ever imagine. And they're not asking for thanks. They're just asking for the dignity of being seen as the human being they've always been.